Now we're ready, Sean. Wonderful. Good evening, everybody. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the 20th Annual Heinrich Böll Weekend 2023. Sie sind herzlich willkommen. Ich freue mich sehr, Sie heute Abend hier begrüßen zu dürfen. Céad míle fáilte, 100,000 welcomes, or as we say in Achill, Siad a Bhaithe. 51 years ago, in 1972, Heinrich Böll won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and 31 years ago, in 1992, the Heinrich Böll Cottage in Dugort, Achill, first opened its doors and has welcomed visual artists, writers and musicians from many places around the world since that time. This weekend is organised by the Heinrich Böll Committee in conjunction with the German Embassy, the Goethe Institute Ireland, Mayo County Council and the Arts Council. It is my great privilege to welcome our guests, Ambassador of the Federal Republic of Germany, His Excellency Meier-Klodt. A warm welcome is also extended to the delegates from the Heinrich Böll Stiftung and the Goethe Institute, which supports the residency of our current resident at the Böll Cottage, Roman Ehrlich. A very special word of welcome is extended also to René Böll, the son of Heinrich Böll. 5 years ago, Dr. Ellen Uberschar, then president of the Heinrich Böll Foundation, addressed this gathering. Impressed as she was by the success of the good work of the Achill Heinrich Böll Committee in keeping the artist's residency alive in the Böll former home, she promised to put a case for funding to refurbish and consolidate the Böll Cottage. Through her representations and with the support of the German Embassy, a grant of €100,000 was made available and the artist's residence was secured for the future. Our committee extends its sincere thanks to the offices of the German Embassy for providing the funding for the restoration of the Heinrich Böll Cottage, and also to the Heinrich Böll Foundation, who negotiated the funding that was provided. I would like to invite any amongst you to visit the cottage tomorrow between 2 and 5 p.m. A special word of thanks is extended to Reverend Maeve O'Herlihy for the use of St. Thomas's Church and also for the use of St. Thomas's Hall. Our gratitude is extended to Victor and staff of Masterson's Bar, Dugort, for providing tonight's refreshments, and thank you to Victoria and Mary for serving us. Also thank you to our guest speakers and to our hard-working committee for the past number of months who have been involved in the organisation of this weekend's events, brought together so seamlessly by our wonderful Secretary, John McHugh. This great committee upholds the shared vision of working to enhance the legacy that Heinrich Böll left to us here in Achill. The development of the residency for writers, artists and musicians is the seminal goal of the committee, alongside the important objective of fostering an appreciation for arts on our island. We uphold the ethos and ideals of Heinrich Böll as the philosophy underpinning all of our activities. In this way, we give voice to his ideals, and we ensure that his ideals do not forever remain on paper, but are personified as catalysts that inspire us into action for the benefit of others. Tonight, we are very mindful of our colleague and fellow committee member, Orla Cafferty, and her family on the sad loss of Orla's brother, Finbar. We also remember the renowned artist Camille Souter, who died earlier this year and who was one of the founder members of the Achill Heinrich Böll Association. Our committee was shocked and saddened by the very recent and tragic loss of our dear friend Anne Shannon. Anne was a stalwart member of our committee for many, many years. May the memory of her quiet demeanour, her wise counsel and her gentle presence continue to support and inspire us. As well as honouring and remembering Heinrich Böll, the underlying theme underpinning our weekend this year focuses on the heritage of writing and eine, on the environment and the involvement of Heinrich Böll in emerging environmental politics in Germany in the 1970s. Biodiversity is essential for the processes that support all life here on Earth, including human life. This weekend gives us the opportunity to reignite and continue the debate concerning biodiversity and the protection of nature. Conversations such as these are necessary to bring awareness and change in light of the many threats that are facing our natural world and which impact all of us. The world can be changed for the better, one thought at a time, one deed at a time, as it is from a single seedling of thought for the good, aligned with knowledge, that great things may grow. The choice for change lies within each one of us, by ourselves and in community with others. On the 30th of September 2022, Ambassador Meier-Klodt and his wife Gladys hosted his reception to mark the German Day of Unity in Dublin. In his address, Ambassador spoke about his admiration for the old Irish meill system, where people collected to gather the crops. He envisaged the adoption of this paradigm, the coming together for the collective good, as an aspiration for Europe. One person should never underestimate their power. Everyone can make a difference. It is in the collective power of the meill that great work is achieved. The fusion of the old ways and the new ways offers us a vision for how we can live together in peace and prosperity and at one with nature. However, there is a caveat. Vision itself is not enough. In order to lift vision off the canvas, commitment is necessary from all of us who care deeply for our children and for the kind of world that we want to shape for them. The world is our home. It is our community. What would the Nobel Prize winner think about how we are addressing these challenges to our natural world placed in front of us today? As we remember him, the Heinrich Böll Committee in Achill is very proud that Heinrich Böll and his family lived among us, and so we honour and remember him. Let us together create new footprints for the future as we celebrate the legacy of the man who loved to be part of nature and enjoyed a walk under the soft Achill rain. This place is our Cara Dílis. Cara Dílis is a lovely term in the Irish language meaning loyal friend. Our place and our word is our loyal friend. Let us be a Cara Dílis, a loyal friend, not only to each other, but also to our place and to our words. To quote the words of John O'Donoghue, let us thank the earth that offers ground for home and holds our feet firm to walk in spaces to infinite galaxies. It is now my great pleasure to ask you to welcome His Excellency Meier-Klodt, German Ambassador, and invite him to perform the official opening of the Heinrich Böll Weekend 2023. Thank you.
Catherine, John, always like to welcome Heinrich Böll and could welcome others, but let me cut it short. Liebe Freunde, dear friends, reiche, such a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Catherine, for your beautiful introduction and speech. Let me echo you on the political remark, and it will be the only one at the outset. If one had thought that this pristine island and lovely place at the far end of the western end of the European Union might spare us from the sad realities at the other end, was enough to open the Irish Times this morning to learn about the very sad demise of Finbar Cafferty, who I understand, whose family is closely related even with this foundation, so may his soul rest in peace, and our thoughts of sympathy with the family also from my end. In such a new paradigm of fear and insecurity, traditions matter even more, and that's why I'm so glad to be back here with you to celebrate, no, not the banshees of Achill, but certainly some other more benevolent spirits around the memory of the unforgotten Heinrich Böll heritage on this island and beyond. As always, so glad to find myself among many familiar faces and dear friends of what I like to call the Böll family in Ireland. And also, as always, certainly a good moment to take stock and look ahead. In this regard, I dare say that I appear before you with a pretty clean conscience as ambassador and representative of the embassy. Catherine, you mentioned what we could do in the area of hardware for this place, but I'd like to mention a few other things. Not only has Heinrich Böll continued to prominently figure in countless briefings of mine, of German political guests or others, I really, and for a good reason, like to take Heinrich Böll and his Irish journal as a point of departure, asking those guests, modern politicians, have you read the Irish journal? Now, let me tell you, Ireland is, the image of Ireland of those days was of a small place, rather poor, very conservative, a land of immigration, monocultural to a large extent, and very much in the shadow of the big neighbor. No, it's not poor anymore, it's quite wealthy, it's not that conservative, quite modern. It is a land of immigration now, and certainly moved out of the shadow of the big neighbor. And you might admit that it's still relatively small, but if you look beyond and the potential of wind energy in this far territory out at the sea, it's even not that small. So that is what always makes it to me very poignant how this country has moved, and what I asked the guests at the end, take all the momentum, the positive momentum Heinrich Böll brought to Ireland in those days and transfer to the modern Ireland and what we might be able to do with it together. Beyond that, and we'll come back to that in the course of this weekend, We organized and actively participated in some key events dedicated to the memory of Heinrich Böll, and in particular, as Kathleen said, in the context of last year's 50-year jubilee of his receiving the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1972. Our main event took place in very close cooperation with the Museum of Literature Ireland, especially his director Simon O'Connor, on 30th November last year, together with the Center for Irish and German Studies of Limerick. Gisela Holfter is here, as well as panelists and participants from different walks of life: politics, research, education, literature, and the diplomatic corps. The one person sadly missing in the end at that event was the one with whom I had kick-started the whole idea earlier in the year, and who no doubt was personally very keen to participate, the then Irish Finance Minister Pascal Donoghue. Let me share this little anecdote with you. My introductory call on him as a new ambassador was one of the most beautiful meetings I've ever had in my career. Of course, I started by praising him for this astutely brokered compromise on the corporate tax, a masterpiece of diplomacy. And from finance, we ended up at some point with literature, him being, as you all know, a fervent reader and even writer of book reviews. And he talked about, and I liked that so much, about the beautiful symmetry of jubilees. The 100 years of Ulysses, the 50 years of Ireland joining the EU. And I said, dear Minister, may I add one element to that beautiful symmetry, Heinrich Böll's Nobel Prize. And he said immediately, that's great. Give me some material to read. You helped me, Gisela. We'll do something about it and make an event. And to the very last minute, we had him on board, we checked again, and then, you know, last year there was difficult moments for him. He could not miss out on one meeting in the Parliament at the time and was not among. But we will continue this setting here tomorrow, and I look forward to that. The second sizable event took place on 1st of February this year at the invitation of Dublin Lord Mayor Caroline Conroy at Mansion House for the launch of the brochure Reconnecting with Böll, an Irish Journey, where again experts from different areas of competence expressed their view of what they consider to be Heinrich Böll's relevance to contemporary Ireland. And this is very much coinciding with the focus you put here, the green heritage, the topics from green energy to biodiversity that are well represented here. And we had René Böll present there too, and a message from Jan Albrecht from the foundation. I think Mr. Albrecht is not yet here today, right? But we'll see him in the course of the wonderful. Special thanks for that event, by the way, to former Minister for the Environment and Green Party leader John Gormley. I put that up. I could certainly dwell on other events, but I think my core message has been sufficiently, I hope, corroborated. The spirit of Heinrich Böll, to a large extent Irish in nature, and still being felt in the country, is alive and kicking. However, certainly no time to lean back. I continue to count, for example, and I wanted to say that to Mr. Albrecht, and we will tell him tomorrow, on an even bigger footprint of Heinrich Böll Stiftung, you know, the political foundation of the Green Party. No better foundation to be here on all those topics in light of the growing importance of all this green wind energy, the potential Ireland has. And one other perspective of interest, I don't know whether all of you have heard of it, next year Ireland, the government, the embassy will stage and the consulates will stage an Irish season in Germany, specifically dedicated to the audience in my country. And I think there's still room to feed into that program some interesting aspects. And I certainly pledge our commitment to those tasks ahead. So, warm thanks to ACL Heinrich-Böll Association, John, Kathleen, all collaborators, all friends and partners with whom I look forward to mingling a bit later tonight and tomorrow in the good tradition of this wonderful, very special weekend. So, same procedure as last year, same procedure as every year, but with many more and other diverse, interesting aspects. Thank you very much. Vielen Dank.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your address and for declaring the Heinrich Böll Weekend 2023 open. And we indeed concur with your sentiments of transference of Heinrich Böll's ideals to the modern Ireland. Since June 2022, Jan Philipp Albrecht serves as president of the Heinrich Böll Stiftung. We were delighted to welcome him to the Heinrich Böll Cottage in September 2022, a glorious day under the beautiful April sunshine. In his absence tonight, Jan Philipp has sent us greetings from Germany, which John will get ready for us now.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear guests of the Heinrich-Böll Weekend, I'm very delighted to speak to you. My name is Jan Philipp Albrecht. I'm one of the two co-presidents of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, headquartered in Berlin, which is a political... Sorry. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear guests of the Heinrich-Böll Weekend, I'm very delighted to speak to you. My name is Jan Philipp Albrecht. I'm one of the two co-presidents of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, headquartered in Berlin, which is a political foundation affiliated to the German Green Party, but is linked to Heinrich Böll as the name patron in several ways. One of it is that we also contribute to the program which is taking place in the Heinrich-Böll Cottage, which I visited just a bit more than half a year ago. So I know the beauty of the island and the situation in which you are right now. And I'm kind of sad to not be part of this weekend now, but I have a lot of other meetings around here in Berlin, so it's unfortunately not possible for me. I'm very happy that we have the cottage and that this connection not only between Ireland and Germany and between Heinrich Böll and his work and the literature and culture community here, but also that there's a connection between the cottage and the weekend on the one side and the whole issue of environment and nature protection all around Ireland and Europe, even globally. And that is something which we as political foundation deal with also in very extensive manner with our offices around the globe. And we think that it is very important to include the view on sustainability, on safeguarding the variety of nature, of biodiversity, as well as, of course, addressing the challenges of climate change in various manners across all political decision-making processes, across all fields of society. And therefore, it's a great opportunity to discuss on those issues also in the course of the Heinrich Böll Weekend, and to exchange on certain challenges which we are facing in order to do so. One of the challenges which we work on is, for example, the possibility to not only storage and green nature in wetlands and bogs, but also to look at those areas from a biodiversity perspective, from a perspective how to use land in the future in a sustainable manner, how to do agriculture, for example, in those areas. And that is something which, of course, is an issue, especially for the region around Echo, and not only for that region, but for many regions around, which also in Germany have been culturally developed in a way of land use, which very often causes CO2 emissions, causes the decline of biodiversity, and causes also problems for soil and water. And that is something we need to have a close look together on, and develop new alternatives and possibilities together with those who use land and those who also work on nature protection and renaturation and climate change possibilities. That is also a reason why we have published so-called atlases on agriculture, on soil, also on bogs, and you will find that also on the website of Böll Stiftung. We also have an English part on that website, and many of these atlases have been translated to other languages, in particular English. So I can only recommend that very closely to you, to have a look into that flagship publications which we have done as Heinrich-Böll Foundation. There's a lot being carried together with our partners. We have a huge partnering network all around the globe with many NGOs working in the environment and social civil society sector. We also have a huge partner network with companies and actors who are trying to build up new ways of doing sustainable business and economy, and that is something we are developing further right now and trying to really build up a fundament for a sustainable future. And we are also doing a lot of events on all of the places which we are represented, in particular here in Berlin, also in Brussels, in our EU office, but we have a lot of offices around the world, unfortunately not in Ireland, although we are, as I said, also present and trying to do cooperations and projects together with other partners in many countries, and also with the Heinrich-Böll Cottage, of course. And I would like to thank those who are working on the success of the cottage and of the weekend, and I hope that we will stay in close cooperation in the future and look together at the opportunities which we have to bring people together, as it's just happening with you on this weekend, and to exchange views and perspectives, best practice, and ideas for the future, and cherish the ideas of Heinrich Böll on meddling into our realities, our lives, and being therefore somehow also politically active in doing so, and shaping the future we want to live in, and also the presence, of course, we want to live in. So I can only invite you also to do so and to use us as a political foundation with all the events and publications we have to get into the substance, to get into exchanges with others, also internationally, and to get in touch also with our influence on the political decision-making process and the development of political programs, in particular from a green policy view, of course. And I therefore hope you will have a great weekend still, and enjoy the nature, the great nature around on Echo, and the marvelous views which you can have also from the cottage, and invite you all to join or visit the Heinrich-Böll Stiftung whenever you come across one of our activities or offices, and I'm happy to also answer questions or keep in touch with you by email or means of communication. If you want to send an email just to me, it's Albrecht, my last name, @böll.de, for any idea you might have and want to share with us. And I'm happy to, at another occasion, be part of that weekend which you are just enjoying. Thank you all, and have a good time. Thank you.
It is wonderful to see and hear Jan Philippe again, and we hope that it won't be too long before we can welcome him to ACL again. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce our next guest speaker tonight, Micheál Ó Briain. Micheál is passionate about Irish and European nature and conservation. He spent almost 30 years working in the European Commission on the development and implementation of EU and international nature and biodiversity policies. Given the European context, he will place the special biodiversity of ACL in a broader European setting. This would also draw upon his experience of working with the different EU countries, including Germany, on setting up a network of protected areas for high-value nature, which includes important ACL sites on land and also in the marine environment. He will illustrate some of the special wildlife of ACL, touch upon some of the key challenges necessary to ensure their conservation, and describe what action is needed to safeguard this precious heritage, while also noting what is happening across Europe. As senior expert and deputy head of the Nature Unit of its Environmental Directorate, Micheál played a leading role in the establishment of Natura 2000, the largest coordinated network of protected areas in the world. This includes areas of high biodiversity importance on ACL Island that are home to rare habitats such as blanket bogs and wet and dry heaths, as well as rare species such as otters, choughs, and the great yellow bumblebee. Prior to working in Brussels, he was National Director of the Irish Wild Bird Conservancy, now Birdwatch Ireland. Micheál is a graduate and former research associate of University College Dublin, where he completed his PhD in zoology, studying ecology and the behaviour of brint geese in Ireland and Canada. He has a long-time interest in the birds and other wildlife of Achill, which he has been recording for over the past 15 years. Since retiring in 2021, he has been based full-time on the island, and he continues his journey of discovery of its special nature. Through his wildlife photography, he aims to celebrate, promote awareness of, and appreciation for this wonderful part of Europe's natural heritage. Micheál's talk tonight is titled Achill's Rich Natural Heritage, a valuable link in the special places for biodiversity in Europe. And after that, I'm nearly out of breath. You're very welcome, Micheál.
Yeah, perfect. Good evening. Oh. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellency, Catherine, John, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honour to be with you tonight. Catherine said a lot in the introduction, which saves me in terms of repeating, but I have a love for the nature of Achill Island, for the nature of Ireland, and of course for Europe. And I've been very fortunate to spend my career working for the protection, conservation, and restoration of the important areas that we have established across the European Union. I spent 30 years in Brussels, working with many wonderful colleagues across 28 countries, unfortunately now 27, colleagues from Germany, from Ireland, from everywhere, to try and cooperate. And I'd like to share today something about the Natura 2000 network, which is one of the great achievements of cooperation between European countries in terms of safeguarding nature. It's still a work in progress. I'd like to say something about the special places on Achill Island in the marine and on land, which many of you may not even be aware of in terms of what you have in terms of the special values. I'll take you through the year in terms of the valley and say some of the experiences I had when I came back to live in Ireland. I was out more often. Some of you may see this strange person walking around with their camera because I try and capture the beauty of the nature. So it's Friday night. I know you're all tired. So this will not be a heavy policy talk. I will try and celebrate the nature through the images that I've captured. I'll also talk about the conservation challenges, because there are real pressures on nature in Achill. And unfortunately, the nature that Heinrich Böll would have seen in the 50s when he came here, much of that has disappeared. And I think we have to acknowledge that, because there's a huge challenge of restoration in relation to nature on Achill and elsewhere throughout Europe. And I'd like to mention by way of conclusion that there are some real opportunities to work together with farmers, with local communities in terms of conserving nature. Oops. I think when most people come to Achill, myself, I've been coming here for over 40 years, they're struck by the extraordinary landscape. The power of the sea that has shaped this coastline, as you see from the wild Atlantic Way. The actual ancient rocks that are 700 million years old in terms of some of the oldest rocks in Ireland. The shape of the Ice Age, the last Ice Age, which was 10,000 years ago, has left its legacy in terms of the Corrie Lakes, in terms of the wonderful landscape at the western end of the island. And of course, many of us derive great pleasure from walking the beach at Kiel or at Keene, and the Minnon Cliffs lit up by the evening sun setting in the west is one of the beauties of Achill Island. So there really is great beauty in the landscape. I wonder what the first settlers on Achill would have seen. You know, there's a record going back probably 6,000 years in terms of the first farmers that came to Achill, looking out from the megalithic tomb, from Schlievemore out over Kiel. And I guess they probably saw a completely different landscape. It was probably a forested landscape. And over time, that landscape has been changed. Man has had a huge influence in terms of the shape of nature on Achill and everywhere else. Obviously, the bogs have grown. It may be climate. It's probably a combination of human use of the landscape and climate that has transformed Achill, which is largely a peat-covered landscape, but that in its own sense has huge value. In terms of the nature of Achill, it has been probably described since the beginning of the 20th century, most notably by the most extraordinary naturalist that Ireland ever had, Robert Lloyd Prager, who visited the area in the early 20th century and described the flora, the rich flora that you would find throughout the island. Species like St. Patrick's cabbage, species like the Irish heath. So this documented for the first time. And I know that Sean Lyson, I don't know if he's here with us tonight, but he has written a lovely biography of Robert Lloyd Prager, who also was instrumental in the greatest survey that was ever carried out in Britain and Ireland of the Clare Island nearby, which also covered Achill Island in terms of birds and other wildlife. So we already knew there was value in the landscape, and he of course captured the essence of Achill in terms of the way that I went, his memoir, biography, in terms of his experience of nature, describing it as windswept, bare, heavily peat-covered, great gaunt mountains rising here and there, and a wild coast hammered by the Atlantic waves on all sides but the east. It has a strange charm which everyone feels but none can fully explain. And I think that captures, in some sense, the essence, even today, of Achill Island. Now, my professional interest in Achill was very much linked to my work in Brussels over 30 years on working with colleagues, working with Ireland and Germany and all the other countries in setting up a network of conservation areas, the most important areas for biodiversity that were identified as being of European interest. This is called Natura 2000. It's based on 2 EU laws, one for the conservation of wild birds, and that came from 1979 when it was recognized that this was a shared natural heritage of all European countries. And we achieved so much more by working together and cooperating in terms of ensuring their conservation. In 1992, this was broadened out to other habitats and species that were considered to be of European conservation concern. And at the core of this was to protect the most important areas. And really, it's an extraordinary achievement to have almost 1/5 of the land protected in this network, 1/10 of the marine, And it's not only about nature reserves and national parks, they form part of it as well, but most of this land is privately owned. So it means working with farmers, foresters, fishers to try and achieve conservation while at the same time having sustainable livelihoods. It's still a work in progress because the network has been largely established. There's some work still for the marine, but as we say, we don't want paper parks. We want something that's real, meaningful, well managed, and in many cases it requires restoration to make that the real nature potential of these areas is realised. And unfortunately, we still have a huge amount of work to do in Ireland and in Germany to really realise this full potential for nature and people. Now, looking at Natura 2000 on Achill Island, you can see that very significant parts of the island are included in this network of conservation areas, both in the marine environment, but also extending very largely over the upland areas, particularly on the island. I'd like to say a little bit about those areas. There are also two what we call natural heritage areas, which are nationally designated areas on the island for the peatlands. I won't cover them because I will focus on the European areas, but to realise that Achill has high biodiversity value and potential. Now, firstly, around the coast from Duiga Head, right out to Achill Head and around by the cliffs to the far end of the island, there is an extraordinarily rich marine environment. All these photographs are mine, so unfortunately I don't specialize in underwater photography. Otherwise, I would share with you the extraordinary riches of the sponges, the sea cucumbers, the brachiopods, all the different reefs, these habitats that are actually living in a very high energy environment, a marine environment. But this is a very important marine area in the European context. You can see it in terms of the sandy bay, the inlets at Kiel. When the tide is out, you can see these little birds, these sanderlings running in and out of the tide, which shows the kind of riches that are actually beneath, because they're feasting on little sandhoppers in the sand. You will see these sea barnacles sometimes washed in, which reflect, again, the marine life. But mostly people will see the mammals, the birds, the seabirds that frequent these areas, such as these common seals that you find around the coast that actually have their pups in Blacksod Bay. Also the grey seals, a larger seal that you'll get on the wilder Atlantic coasts, and you get them around the far side of the island and out on the Inishkees. And of course, one of the wonderful jewels of Achill's natural heritage is Keem. The waters of Keem attract the basking sharks. If we go out there tomorrow, you would see that the basking sharks, on a sunny day when the plankton rise, you have these wonderful sightings of the second largest fish on the planet. And they come in, there can be groups of up to 20 or 30 basking sharks in around Achill at this time of the year, reflecting the marine life, the rich plankton that is there. And this bird that you see beside it is the gannet. It's the largest seabird that we have in Europe, and it's dwarfed in comparison with the basking sharks. So this is one of the treasures of Achill. It wasn't always looked after because there was unsustainable exploitation after the Second World War for the liver of the sharks, which was used in oil lamps and heating, and thankfully that practice discontinued and the sharks are fully protected today. You also have the bottlenose dolphins that frequently come around the coast, coming into Keem, coming into Kiel, and again that reflects the richness of the marine environment on Achill. There are seabirds, not only the gannet, but you get a whole rich variety of other seabirds that are using these waters. The bird on the top right is the fulmar. You get them nesting on the cliffs at Minnon, on Inishgalloon, of Perteen, and around the coast. There's another beautiful little bird, the black guillemot. It's like a small little pigeon, black and white pigeon on the water, and they nest in the cliffs. But Achill doesn't have big seabird nesting colonies. The waters are very rich in terms of feeding. You have to go offshore to the Bills Rocks, 10 kilometers offshore from Moytogue Head, and there is a major seabird nesting colony for this beautiful little bird, the puffin, and there are other seabirds such as the storm petrel. This is a designated area under Natura 2000 as well. So there is an extraordinary rich marine life around Achill Island, and I think we should be aware of that. The largest Natura 2000 area on land extends from Achill Head right all the way to Dugort and embraces the two great mountains that we have on the island, Slievemore and Croghan. And this embraces a whole variety of different habitats, from the blanket bogs up through different heathland types right onto the mountain top. So there is an extraordinary richness of habitats, and probably one of the most wonderful, precious parts of Achill Island is the northern face between Slievemore and Saddle Head. It's the area of Eine, which is very few people actually probably visit, but it is one of the wilder parts of the island, and it really is a treasure. You can see the Corrie Lake there at Loch na Ciaróga. This is an area where you have ravens, you have the peregrine falcon, and it once was a place where two species of eagles, the white-tailed eagle and the golden eagle, would have reigned. Sadly, they were exterminated through persecution, and I think the last golden eagle was found in the early part of the 20th century. They have been seen. I think, John, you've seen golden eagle back. I still search for them in hope. They are returning to Ireland. They have been reintroduced in Killarney and up in Donegal, and it's only a matter of time, I expect, that they will be back gracing those cliffs, because there's something missing in terms of the fact that we don't have eagles on Achill Island. Looked from the summit of Slievemore, you get this sense of the actual exposed bareness of the landscape. It's not about grazing in this case, it's about the sheer force of actually nature. And this is one of the most important identified areas for bryophytes, these mosses and lichens. It's one of the three most important areas in Ireland for these actual rare plants. Looking up from the deserted village, which would have been a familiar landscape for Heinrich Böll, you can see in late summer, you can see that it's a richness of heather, the different types of heather, and of course that is home to different species, most notably the skylark, but also a whole range of other plants and animals. This little bee on the right-hand side was one that I came across last summer. It's called the heather coletes. It's a solitary bee, and I discovered it at several places on the island. It had not been seen here since 1913. So that shows that there's still a lot of nature that hasn't been discovered on the island, and it only means that people need to get out and obviously explore and discover. Then moving down, you will also find that in the lower reaches, where the deeper peat occurs, there are extensive areas of blanket bog. A lot of it has been worked out in terms of turf exploitation, but you can see here the richness in terms of the bog cotton. The little plant in the top center is the sundew, which is a parasitic plant, because there's so few nutrients in these peatlands that the plants actually need other ways in which they get nutrients, and this little plant actually feeds on insects, so it derives its nutrients from them. And there are many other species like the bog asphodel, marsh orchids, and of course the sphagnum provides home for species like this common frog. So there's an extraordinary richness and diversity in the landscape, and of course we have to care for it. The next site I will refer to, the next Natura 2000 site, is called Keelmacher Menon Cliffs. And what's extraordinary about this is that you have a whole range of habitats, from the beach, the shingle bank, the macaire, the sand dunes, right up onto the mountainside in terms of the different heathlands. So this is one of the great assets of Achill. Behind that shingle bank, which stretches for most of Trámór, you have an area of macaire. Now that has been transformed. There is a golf course there, there's a lot of grazing, but in the areas of the wetter parts of the macaire, there are rich habitats for mosses, including a rare little liverwort called the petalwort. And of course, the lakes, Keeloch and Shrughelbeg, provide a refuge for wintering water birds. Migrant birds like this golden plover actually frequent the macaire on migration. And this little bird in the bottom right-hand side is one of the nesting birds, the ringed plover, that nest along those shingle banks. So it's a fragile environment, but it's also a very rich and diverse environment. Moving over to this side of the island, there's a smaller area of macaire, but it's one of the most beautiful parts of Achill Island. This is formerly called Dugort Macaire Loch Du. It's a special area of conservation, but it's also a special protection area for birds. It's also called the Valley Sandy Banks, and very clearly the local community have made that known that this is the proper name that it should be called, so maybe it should be changed to recognize that. Looking down from Slieve Moor, you can get that sense of the northeast corner of Achill, with all its lakes, with the macaire, with the Golden Strand and the Dugort Strand. So that's an extraordinary rich part of Achill. And I was saying, I took this picture last April, I was saying to Sheila McHugh that I could almost see her walking on Dooniver Beach in her bare feet. So she felt a little bit under scrutiny, but she can rest assured that I hadn't. But you can see here the macaire along the area, and that's a very important part of it. Behind it is a wonderful lagoonal area called Shrugel, which actually is a very fine wetland area, and that's a wintering place for many, many different types of birds. Not visited by many people, but it's an extraordinary rich. Unfortunately, like a lot of the Achill coastline, particularly around this corner, there's serious erosion taking place. In the 15, 16 years that I've been visiting this area, that bar between the lagoon and the sea is disappearing. So probably it's only a matter of time before the power of erosion, the sea, the more extreme weather events that we're getting will actually change that. And what I'd like to do is just to take you, looking at this corner of Achill, just to take you through a year as to what you would experience out on the macaire and in the lakes. One of the beautiful birds that you can find on Achill in January is the whooper swan. There are whoopers on Keel Lake, Shrughelbeg, on the Keel side of the island, but there's about 50 of them that spend the winter on the macaire. They also benefit from having the safety of Loch Namrack and Loch Du, the lakes, where they can seek refuge when they are disturbed and at night. They are faithful to these areas. This bird here down in the center is carrying a leg ring, which I observed in about 7 or 8 years ago, and it kept coming back to the area, showing that birds are faithful to their wintering grounds, which makes sense, because if it works and you're fed well, it makes sense to come back to the same restaurant in years. So this is what you would expect to see in January. Around the coastline in winter, because Achill, remember, is on the western fringe of Europe, it has very mild weather compared to many parts like Germany. So there is a migration of many birds to Western Europe. And these little shorebirds, this purple sandpiper, it really does live on the edge. It's right at the edge of the tide, the waves come in, crashing in, and it jumps up, but it's feeding on small little shellfish and other mollusks that are actually around the coast. There's many other waders, but I just like to single out the bird on the top right. This is the curlew. These are wintering birds on Achill nowadays. They come from Scotland, from Scandinavia. And unfortunately, it's a bird that really has dramatically declined in Ireland over the last 30 years. When I went to work in Brussels in the early 1990s, there were 5,000 breeding pairs still in Ireland. Nowadays, there's probably about 100. And it reflects the catastrophic decline that these birds have experienced through all the changes that are taking place in the landscape. It would have been a breeding bird on Achill in the past. Unfortunately, it's no longer with us. There are conservation efforts being made, but it shows the seriousness that nature is facing. Achill is an extraordinary place for the otter. If you go around the coast or look on the lakes, quietly, discreetly, there's a very good chance that you will see the otters. Sometimes you will see a female with 2 cubs or a male patrolling the coast. They feed in the marine environment on crabs, but they have to come inshore to wash themselves in fresh water because salt water on the fur doesn't work for them. So it really is one of the riches. I saw 2 of them on Loch Namrack, quite close to here, yesterday evening. Another bird that you will find around the shoreline from Dooniver Strand to the valley and also over at Kiel and in Achill Sound is this beautiful small black and white goose. It's called the Brent goose. I spent many years studying this species in Ireland, and it brought me to Canada to their breeding grounds in the very high Arctic. And I just wanted to show those images that I'd taken on Bathurst Island in the 1980s to convey the sense of the links between Achill and other parts of the world in terms of the extraordinary migrations that species take. These birds travel 5,000 kilometers back to their breeding grounds. They can live for 20 years or more. So you can think of the extraordinary migrations that they take. In summer, they rub shoulders with polar bears and Arctic wolves. So it really, they live in a totally wild, extraordinary places, and yet they come here and depend upon Achill and other parts around our coast in winter. Another little gem of Achill is the Irish hare. It's a variation of the mountain hare. It does not go white in winter as many of its cousins do. It's one of the most ancient mammals that we have, going back 28,000 years. There are remains in Waterford to record that this species has been around for a great length of time. This individual was in its form. I came upon it one day. It was asleep. I woke up, and you can see its reaction was one of a little surprise. I didn't disturb it. He just ran off a bit and continued what it was doing. All my observations of Achill wildlife, I do report them, including to the National Biodiversity Record Centre. Interestingly, when it comes to the hare, when you report the hare, they will not give the geographic reference of your sighting, because unfortunately, hares are still subject to people capturing them illegally for coursing. And so it's just, I find I'm all for sustainable use and management, but I really think that there are certain practices in the 21st century that we should not be continuing. In April, you start to see the flowers and all the other wildlife starting to take bloom. And this is one of the very rare moths that can only be found in the western fringe of Scotland and Ireland. It's linked to the macaire. It's linked to the sand dune system. It's called the belted beauty. And that's a male on the left. And the extraordinary thing about the life cycle of this species is that the female, you can see it up on the top right, under the male, the female is flightless. So the male flies around, sometimes during the late afternoon, and then obviously searches for the female. They occur at Kiel, and also last year we discovered them. Kathy Lynchicone from the Valley also discovered it was present at the Valley sandy banks. And this is its caterpillar, which is depending upon the bird's foot trefoil. So this is one of the rare species that is in Achill and depending upon the Macaire and the sand dune system. I mentioned about the decline of the wading birds, these little shore birds that depend upon open landscapes. And this bird is still here on Achill. It's called the lapwing. It's the national bird of Ireland. And they are still trying to succeed in nesting in the valley, sandy banks, just in the wet Macaire area at Loch Dhu. There are several pairs. It was once much more abundant over at Kiel and in Loch Dhu area, but there's only probably 3 or 4 pairs now left. Last year I watched them and they nested, but unfortunately they didn't manage to raise one young because their predators, foxes, crows, and you can see a heron coming in on the breeding territory, actually eliminated the possibilities. So the habitat, the landscape is no longer actually suitable because unfortunately the pressure of grazing and other things has led to that, and predators have actually taken the young. Into May, you see that there's other migrants, the last of the migrants. This is bird on the top right is like a small curlew. It's called a whimbrel. In fact, they call it the May bird. They're migrating through on their way to Iceland to nest. And the Macaire habitat at Kiel and at the valley is really important. They stop off, they refuel as they're heading on the final stage. And this little bird on the right used to be a common nesting bird in the valley and probably elsewhere on Achill Island. It's called the dunlin. Unfortunately, they have disappeared as a nesting bird, not only from Achill, but from many places where they nested in the Macaire around the western coast. And this is probably going to be the next bird that becomes extinct in Ireland as a breeding bird. There's only probably 20 or 30 breeding pairs struggling to survive in Ireland. And it really is a shame that in the 21st century we were talking about such things happening to species like this. Moving on through the summer, late spring, you have the primroses, you have the sea thrift, the sea campion, the ragged robin. These are all the flowers that will actually thrive. They're there in the landscape, and when they're given a chance, they will actually blossom. And you can see that along the roadside verges for the primroses. Unfortunately, you don't see them on the Macaire nowadays because there's too much grazing. And I just want to make that clear that these are only in areas where you will actually have some seizure for a while of grazing to allow the plants and the pollinators. And where you do get those opportunities, you get this extraordinary richness of pollinators. We hear a lot nowadays about the decline of pollinators in Germany, in Ireland, but yet they still actually survive here in Achill. On the left you have 2 of the butterflies, the small tortoiseshell and the green hairstreak, which would be familiar to people are here on Achill Island. But there's another relative to the butterflies, the moths, that come out at night. And for every butterfly there's probably about 10 species of moth here on Achill. And there's some extraordinary species. Look at this moth here, the emperor moth, which comes out at this time of the year. And it has these wonderful eyes, mimicking eyes of a bird, and it's a form of, it's self-defense, that if some predator comes, it flashes, so therefore it's protected. Another one is the elephant hawk moth, which in my garden at Duniver, I've actually recorded over 200 different types of moths, and I probably have only scratched the surface in terms of what's here on Achill and in the west of Ireland. There's another fantastic little group of pollinators called hoverflies, which again, people are only starting to discover in relation to the richness and diversity of the different plants and animals. Into July, it's feeding time for all the birds that have emerged, including these sand martins that are begging, demanding to be fed. with all the food that is actually available at Loch na Brac. Look, also the actual mallard and the mute swans. This is when nature is actually at its strongest in terms of expression. And again, where grazing has been managed in terms of the fields behind the Macair and in the valley, you will see wonderful profusions of pyramid orchids, lady bedstraw, this rare plant, the field gentian on the right-hand side. And that profusion also provides opportunities for rare butterflies, that dark green fritillary, and visitors from southern Europe. This is a hummingbird hawk moth which I saw in the valley last summer. And when you spend time in nature, you sometimes come across something really special. And last August, I came across this little bumblebee. It's called the great yellow bumblebee. It's the rarest bumblebee in Ireland. They have dramatically declined. They're only on the Macair and sand dune systems on the western fringe. The main area is up in Belmullet, where they still have a healthy population. I saw one of them in the valley last summer. And this is really of high conservation concern. There's a national plan for the recovery of this great yellow bumblebee. So there's hope in that these species are still here, but they are in a very precarious state. There are other endangered pollinators that I came across last summer. On the right is a little bumblebee called the large carder bumblebee, which is also of conservation concern. And you will see them on the red clover and other plants where they get an opportunity to feed. There's another little bee, and this was discovered by a visiting naturalist, Celia Grobnes. I don't know if she's with us tonight. She'll be here over the weekend. This is called the northern coletes. It's another highly threatened species in Ireland that is depending upon the Macair, and we discovered them at the valley. So there are really interesting species of wildlife in the area. One of the gems of the wildlife of Achill Island is the charismatic chough. It's a beautiful crow that has red bill and legs, and this really, Achill provides great conditions for them in terms of the cliffs at Minnon around the island where they can actually nest. And you get up to 70 or 80 of them gathered together on the Macair at the valley in late summer. You sometimes in late summer or early autumn into September, October, you see these strange people walking around with binoculars and telescopes, bird watchers, coming to Achill Island to look for bird migration. And I don't know if you noticed, but this English bird watcher, his name is Josh Jones, is trying to photograph a little bird called the semi-palmated sandpiper. It was so close to him that he couldn't use his proper camera, he was using his phone. And this is the bird. It came all the way from Canada or the United States. It was in the valley. And right beside it was a Siberian bird, a little stint. So here was a case of East meets West on Achill Island. So maybe there's a lesson there through nature that we can actually come together and live in harmony. Moving into autumn, the winter birds, the widgeon, are back on Shrughill, at Shrughill Beg. The diving ducks, the tufted ducks, are on the different lakes around the island. And of course, where you get prey, you get predators. This wonderful, beautiful little bird is called a merlin. It's the smallest of the falcons. They do nest in Ireland. It's a very scarce nesting bird, but they also come to Ireland from Iceland to spend the winter. Again, reflecting the richness of the birds. And we move back more into November in winter. It's the cycle of nature. The whooper swans are back in on the Macair. They shared it with some pink-footed geese and some grey-lag geese. So it was coming back into the cycle of events. And Achill gets birds coming during the cold weather period into the Macair. This is a redwing. It's a thrush that would spend the winter in Europe. And when you get the cold spell, as we had last December before Christmas, A lot of these thrushes migrate because they have a better chance of survival on Achill Island. And the final discovery last year was this strange duck. It's called a white-winged duck, which turned up in the valley. It was the first time it was ever seen in Ireland, and it attracted hundreds of birdwatchers to Achill Island. All these crazy people with their cameras and telescopes and binoculars. But it showed, if you have interesting wildlife, you attract lots of people. So it is part of the actual ecotourism of potential of the island. So that just gives you a taste of what you will find throughout the year. But I think it wouldn't be fair if I was to say, well, it's all great, we have this extraordinary richness, without also saying that we have big challenges here on Achill as elsewhere. The valley once was grazed by cattle. It was a cattle graze system. But come the 1980s, it switched to sheep. And of course, grazing is part of the management of this landscape. But if you put 500 sheep on a macare, there's very little left for nature. And unfortunately, that is one of the big challenges that is faced, is how you manage and work with farmers to actually ensure that you have a socio-economic grazing system which also is looking after nature. Some of the birds will benefit from the sheep. Those starlings were obviously having a little piggyback, but there are too many dead sheep, and that provides food for hooded crows. Predators then eat the breeding waders. So the balance isn't there, and that's, I think, something that needs to be addressed. There's a new arrival on Achill Island, and I honestly, when I saw this, I actually took this picture just off Achill on the way to Crom, but they're actually on Achill at different places. And you know, it's extraordinary to see a red deer. It's a beautiful animal, and I think it's great to see them back here, but they do present huge challenges in terms of how you manage it. There are no natural predators of red deer on Achill Island, and I don't think there will be anytime soon. But so it does actually raise the question of how we manage the relationship between the grazing animals in the absence of natural predators. Then there's the issue of burning. It's only a couple of weeks ago when there was a serious fire at the bog between the valley and Bunacurry. That bog is a protected area under national legislation. And these fires cause huge damage to the structure of the ecosystem. They wipe out all the insects, they damage the peat, and it's not really sustainable as a practice. Now, whether that was done deliberately, some people would say these are done by people who want more grazing, or whether it was an accident through carelessness of somebody burning refuse, it still causes too much damage. This fire here took place a few years ago just above the Heinrich Böll cottage. So you might have actually had to go out and see the ashes of Heinrich Böll's cottage, because it's not only a risk to nature, it's a risk to people and to homes. And I think this fire here at Saol a few years previously, this is something that needs to be managed, because the fire brigade had to come out a few weeks ago. 3 fire brigades, a helicopter, and obviously people are put at risk. So it's a problem not only on Achill, but it's a problem that we have to address. And unfortunately, not every plant on Achill is welcome, because there are non-native species that have actually caused a lot of disruption to the ecology. This giant rhubarb is a beautiful plant in Chile, but it's not a native plant on Achill Island, and unfortunately it has spread. Prager didn't record it in 1903, so it actually has spread in places, particularly, unfortunately, Duiga, but also at Bunacurry. You can see, particularly when the ground is disturbed, you can see that these plants are causing ecological damage. This is listed on a European regulation for invasive species. So Ireland is legally obliged to do something to actually deal with this problem. You also have the rhododendron, a beautiful plant, but it's everywhere in places, particularly where this land is abandoned, there's no management of it, and it spreads over the landscape. And where you get rhododendron, you get very little else in terms of nature. And of course, we now have Japanese knotweed along the roadside. You see these signs. And of course, that's another plant that poses problems. So there are challenges in terms of dealing with the nature. And there's another challenge, and it's us. In terms of the fact, I love Achill Island, I want to roam freely, and I'm really grateful to the farmers and the landowners who allow me to walk over their land. I've never been stopped. I'm respectful of their property. But if Achill Island becomes more popular after the Banshees and all the other movies that are taking place, there's a risk that we may love the place to death in terms of unsustainable tourism. And just to give you an example, since I started coming here, surfing seems to become more popular. And that's brilliant because it's part of the fabric of the economy of the area and it provides opportunities for outdoor recreation. But if you have 12 months of the year surfing on Keel Loch, you don't get the whooper swans anymore. There used to be about 100 whooper swans coming there in October, November. They don't come there anymore. So there has to be a place for people to surf and also for the whooper swans to be able to actually feed and rest after their migrations from Iceland. And dare I say it, there's also the big challenge moving forward is how we deal with the issue of turf and the peatlands. Peatlands are one of the most important stores of carbon on the planet, much more than forests, even though they occupy a much smaller part. And there's a tradition, rightly so, of using peat as a form of heating, domestic heating on the island. Probably one of the greatest controversies that I had to work on in my career in Brussels was to deal with the issue of peat extraction on protected peatlands, particularly in the Midlands. And that's still not fully resolved as an issue. So we need to explore ways in which people need to be able to heat their homes. And we need to transition. This is the great challenge. The ambassador talked about renewable energy, wind energy, and we need to find ways in which we transition from using peat, that people still have security of heating their homes, and that we talk about actually restoring the peatlands on Achill Island. So, sorry for all that despair, but that's the truth. We have beauty, we have extraordinary nature, but we have a huge amount of pressures. But they're not insurmountable. So I sometimes get a little bit annoyed when I'm on Twitter and I see people describing Achill as a wasteland or it's destroyed. Yes, there are problems, but they're not irreversible. Through the will, through working with the communities, the landowners, the farmers, a lot of good can be achieved. And there are opportunities there as well. Just to give you one example that has only started, it was officially launched, going back to the EU. I was in Brussels when this project was selected under the LIFE programme. LIFE is an extraordinary financial instrument to support nature restoration, particularly in protected areas. So this project, which deals with the Macaire habitat in 9 different areas from Donegal down to Galway, including in the valley, is a big opportunity to work with farmers to restore nature in the valley. And it's already starting. I mentioned the lapwing, the breeding lapwing. There's already been a protective exclosure put up in the valley to help the lapwing, to keep the predators out, to let the vegetation grow. So it's temporary. It'll be taken away later when the lapwing stop nesting. And there are several pairs of lapwing in there, and let's hope for the first time we'll actually see them successfully nesting and a thriving population re-established. But this system will only work if it can be combined with the big funds under agriculture. And the agriculture policy is central to how we deal with nature restoration. There's a new scheme, it's called Acres, that is being set up by the Department of Agriculture with farmers. And the LIFE project in the Valley and elsewhere will be combined with this in order to make sure that farmers get paid in terms of their delivery of services. So if a farmer produces food, which they're expected to do, this is really important, but they also provide other services like climate benefits, carbon benefits, and also nature benefits. And I think we should recognize and reward what farmers can do. Of course, doing that in a commonage where you may have 40, 50 or more owners is going to be interesting. There's another big project taking shape in this part of the world, from Donegal down to Galway as well, and that's to try and work towards restoring the blanket bogs. Now, there are many sites in Mayo, but unfortunately the nearest one to Achill is Lough Gall on the Currán Peninsula. But this again is going to work with farmers to restore nature, paying them for the results that they deliver, and there's going to be a huge body of experience that is transferable to Achill in terms of restoring peatlands, including dealing with things like rhododendron. So they're building up that expertise, and I think this is another opportunity. That's Dugort East Bog between the Valley and Bunacurry, as it should look like at this time of the year. And finally, just to bring it back into the European context, there is a huge initiative as part of the European Green Deal, and I think there is a serious attempt at the European level to work towards a sustainable model, not only on biodiversity, but obviously on climate, but also on the whole food system and on the circular economy. But as part of the biodiversity agenda, the most important European initiative for nature is a proposed nature restoration law that is now being negotiated with the member states and the European Parliament. And for the first time, that will really give a great focus on the challenge of restoring nature. We've lost so much nature in Europe. It will provide opportunities, particularly for things like peatlands, to bring them back, to restore. Can you imagine in the future meeting farmers in Achill and they say, I am a proud carbon farmer. I'm looking after carbon and I'm getting paid for doing that. That's the model for the future. Not only about producing sheep, but also producing vital services such as carbon farming. And I think this nature restoration law, combined with other initiatives that are now being negotiated at the European level, will, I think, facilitate that debate in terms of helping restore nature. I hope that wasn't too heavy for you on a Friday evening, but it just gives you a taste that there is extraordinary richness here on Achill. There are big challenges, but they are not insurmountable. Thank you. You judge the time. If you want one or two questions, or if you want to move on to the next speaker. Yeah, we'll move on. That's grand. Yeah, that's fine. Grand.
Lovely, Michal.
Thank you very much. Oh, yeah.
For a minute, just to get them.
Just announce it there. You want to take announce it there?
Did you announce it, John?
Okay.
You announce it, yeah. Yeah. Just for a minute, yeah.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, just before we go on to the next speaker,
We're going to take 5 minutes. Okay? So if you're going out for a cigarette, you can have half of one. Okay? Thank you.
was lovely. It was a lovely neighbour to have. Like,
Oh, I kept him going. You had such a lovely mother.
oh, yeah, she was.
She wonderful. Your sister.
She was in England now. She's a barrister and at a social worker. She's a social worker. I haven't seen her since before COVID. Last time she was.
I spent many years in England too.
Yeah.
40-odd years.
I remember yourself and Anne and Kathleen. Yeah. You were up there. Edward wasn't there then.
Right, that's right.
Oh, just watch out for the drink.
I remember before at the youth surgery, but when Jenny used to play tennis as well. And there was a skull in the.
Yes.
I thought it was horrible. Every time I had to go in there, I had to let people in.
Oh, great. He used to tell us, give us updates about YouTube. Yeah.
I was very upset when he died because I was actually an autograph at his funeral.
We were all very upset.
I shouldn't have really been allowed to be there.
We'll get started.
Yeah, no, yeah. I think about it.
Could I just ask if just our next speaker, Art, I would just like to say that was a fantastic and wonderfully illustrated presentation, Michal, and thank you. And by illustrating some of the special wildlife in Achill, you have indeed touched upon, Michal, some of the key challenges that are necessary to ensure conservation, and you have described what is really needed to safeguard this very precious heritage that we have. Our next speaker tonight is Ó Súilleabháin. Art was born in Cornamona in County Galway, and he spent some years in Boston, USA. He worked in Dublin and in Mayo as a teacher, in Castlebar as the director of the Mayo Education Centre, and he lectured at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. as a Fulbright scholar before returning to Ireland. He has published a number of collections of poetry as Gaeilge for children. He has won the Northwest Words Poetry as Gaeilge in 2017. His work has been featured in many publications. His first collection of poetry in English, Mayflies in the Heather, was published by Revival Press in 2021. Art has read a number of pieces for Sunday Miscellany on RTE Radio. Art has been selected for Poetry Ireland introductions in 2022 and subsequently read as Gaeilge at the Dublin International Literary Festival. He is presently working towards a collection of poetry as Gaeilge for adults and a new collection in English. We will now enjoy the pleasure of listening to some of Art's work tonight, the theme of which he has titled Dánta grá don saol, don nádúr agus don duine. This translates as love poems, love for life, for nature and for people. You are very welcome, Art.
Excellency, Kathleen, John, I'm very honoured to be here. It's a kind of a strange thing for a poet to be given such an audience as yourselves. And as Kathleen translated, Gradun saol, Gradun duine, Gradun nádúr, love of people, love of place, and love of person. That's what the theme is of the readings I'm going to now. The poems come from various collections or various magazines. And in this part of the world, as Michal so rightly said, our larger neighbour tried to kill our language. So I'm one of the biodiverse people that actually still use the Irish language. Now, for that, I know I have an audience that the Irish language is kind of strange. So I have brought along, I haven't enough of them, but I'll give them out. And if I give 2 to every row, you'll have enough to look in. There's an English translation. The English translations of the Gaeilge are a bit schmaltzy, as I call it sometimes. Things don't translate well. Anybody that has ever tried translation, you'll know that. They don't translate from any one language to another language. But I was fortunate in that I got 2 languages. I was brought home from Boston by my parents when I was 8. I learned the Irish language. And I'm now one of the strange beings that speaks Irish whenever I get the chance. Whatever. And I write sometimes in Irish, a lot of the time. Sometimes I don't know what I write. It comes out in English or it comes out in Irish. I don't know what. These poems that I'm doing tonight originated in the Irish language. So I have translations. So please forgive me sometimes if the translations are a little bit schmaltzy, as I call them. And Kathleen, somebody might hand them out. If there's 2 in each row, there might be enough to go down. And it gives you a chance. Not that I want you shuffling papers, but yeah, I can bring them down the back. And make sure Sheila gets one down the back. I promised Sheila that I'd give her one down the back. And as they're being handed out, I mean, 2 to every row there, if you give 2 to every row, at least you'll be able to see what's happening. And you might make sense of the Irish language, because the Irish language comes first, and then an English translation comes next. So I'm on page 2, if you don't have to shuffle. I'm on page 2. I give you a moment for that to be passed around. So rather than putting them up on screen, I have given them out. Okay, how are you doing, Kathleen? There's one for, that's grand. Right, the first one I'll read is on page 2, and it's a question. I don't want answers, because there may be some in the audience that might know what I'm talking about. I don't want an answer, but I'm just putting a question to you. And maybe you'll ask yourself the question, because, as I said, the thing is Gradun saol. Well, do you really love life? And it's on sale, I'll read it in Irish, on sale law. Excuse me, I'm gone to that age where I have to have my glasses. Tá na bláhanna go hálinn idir balú agus da, ach tá ceanháin a léiríonn go bhfuil an saol seo ina leah. Leah a bhleaníonn sús agus leah a bhleaníonn síos, leah a chluiseann fuiseog agus leah a chluiseann giosc. Leah a láireann molú agus leah a láireann cáin, leah a bhlaisian mill agus leah a bhlaisian grán. Leah a hóisian lehan agus leah a hóisian caol, leah a ecan deis agus leah a ecan bail. And here's the question. Cén leah a bhain an leatsa, an bhfuil de chinne dianta fós, an bhfuil rós a measc na neallag, nó deallag a measc na rós. I heard a murmur, so somebody did understand all the world in a flower. I'm on page 3. All this, as I said, the translations are a bit schmaltzy, but what harm? It's asking you a question. All the flowers are beautiful, full of colour and scent, but there is one among them which tells which half of the world you represent. Half who look upwards and half who only look down. half who hear the skylark sing and half who wear a frown, half who praise your efforts and half who always blame, half who taste the honey and half who are always lame, half who measure wide and half who measure short. You remember the shops that did that on you, you know. Yeah. Half who see the opportunity and half who only seek to thwart. Quietly I ask you, I really don't want your reply. In which half of life do you fit? Have you decided yet? For you, are there roses among the thorns, or thorns among the roses? And as I said, just think about it for a second. The second one I chose, and I had to pick long before I arrived tonight, but it's very valid for the time and ackle that's in it. And it's me thinking about my children. This was published some time ago. Níor war sibh coga. Níor war ma fáistí coga riamh, ní aca siad creachtaí, a thucraí súile go ciúnas. Níor chóla siad tardan riamh, a dimpaí creach. Níor wala siad brean an bháis riamh, a chroch srána eile. Níor hiúil siad láthair chatha riamh tar éis marú fuiltí. Níor il siad a bhaile ina dust riamh. Ag smaoinemh gár uim a léiríonn dúnmharú glórhar, ach airí siad wathú óg. Níor airí siad wathú óg dhíreathar riamh, a hit mar dhilóg tíomh lá, fógraithe mar chostas chogaí. Níor ólam siad cacamas riamh an chaint caite letíomh ó ghaoine le fis. Níor war mise coga ach an erid, ach tá eine agam rinte war. Tá súil agam nach marí ma fáistí sin riamh, riamh, riamh. Page 4. Here's a translation of it. You do not know war. My children have never known war, have never seen wounds that glazed eyes to silence, never heard sounds that prayed for an end, never smelled the stink of death that lingered on other noses, never wandered a battlefield in the aftermath of bloody carnage. They never came home in silence, remembering imminent noises that broadcast booming murder, never missed a younger brother who fell quietly at their side, declared a casualty of battle, never knew the nonsense of discarded discourse from those who knew. I have never known war either, but I know some who have. I hope that my children will never know it. Never, never, never. Gumilishgil? Rivnanolog. Rivnanolog mliana. Agus fed siu átégan an Italín. Le diana Rivnanolog freshen. But yeah, vi me sminu agus níor smini me gomach sé chá trohu agus a vi in akel tróna. I didn't realize it was going to be so important in akel, because one of their children, as I said, did know war and the awfulness of it. And that was my look at life. The rest of the poems have something to do with nature and the awfulness of what happens. Báiste chumachrí is the next one. And Báiste chumachrí is rain in my heart. Places in the world that are receiving too much rain. Not in Achill, of course. But anyway. And it's a mixture of the way the climate is changing and also litir gra for the person. Báiste chumachrí. Tá tarach mal. A numar go báistí. Ráirta isce i mo chrí, tusa as afarc, as baile, as éisteacht, in glean na níle, uignas ag búlan na fuinneoige. Lochard, broch báte, scaha fwy isce, seahan na nochas. Cal tille tá daifnacht de gwifna awn na brynne, máhas ag titim le fána. Cé, le tanta ag grich ar y molach, fannacht garfi na goach, Ishe ag glugurnaí, pú, 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 ina díg tas le mais, go dtí sin cua na garad. ach tá saor a thugann agus siúla tú isteach lá gréine, beit bháin le mo híomh a meas trimach na sól, a weiscecht fad chracin wem. And on page 7, there's a translation. Now, my translations are not literal. They're a little bit, they're not literal, I'll put it that way. Rain in my heart. Spring is late. Too much rain. A rough waterfall inside. Out of sight. Away from home. Out of listening. Loneliness beating the window. A high lake. Bank drowned. Beware rocks just below the surface. Depth in the memory of river. In the Nile Valley. Happiness falling from a cliff. Waves flowing over a quay. Waiting the cuckoo's rough weather. Calling in flight. After her deception, a heat comes. Until then, solitude of friends. But summer is imminent. You will walk in on a sunny day. We'll be there by my side amidst drying eyes, a skin's distance away. Michal and Kathleen referred to biodiversity. There's a picture on the next one, actually. There's a picture on the next poem on page 8. It's called Saidri na Breataine ar a Bartach. Now, if anyone knows Saidri na Breataine, they were known as the redcoats. And one of the lichens appears like that and is actually called in Irish, not given its Latin term, it's called Nacoti Daraga. The redcoats. Saidri na Breataine ar a Bartach. And John mentioned something about saving the bogs. That's how this poem starts. Cunni na portaí. Cunni na portaí. Is muide na saidri línte go cam, hati daraga ag seasamh an ardja. Beg nach gaintórin, ciúin, blasan an crotal an péir, le grim ar chran wásithe, ag alpa ámuid feote, gramithe ar chairigracha, malartíon siad rianta na meo, tríd leanán siambósach. Fungus is algae ag búla cracin, I marog, marmor, rodan. Rihin frévacha dawin bia don a rév iana, da egen da ollan chrua, Cladonia Christatella, glean siad a gorfa beg, cunni na portaí, cunni na portaí. And on page 9, there's a translation of that. I don't know, is the picture, maybe the picture is on page 9 or page 8, I can't remember, whichever you got. British soldiers of the marsh. Save the bogs. Save the bogs. We are soldiers in ragged lines, red hats standing to attention, almost silent, hushed. Lichens taste the air, cling to listless trees, devour decaying wood, stick to secure rocks, swap the traces of life through symbiotic lovers. Algae and fungi copulate in a Rodan embrace. Roots run deep, food for reindeer, dye for harsh wool. Cladonia Christatella cry out in tiny chorus, save the bogs, save the bogs. And I don't know, was the picture on page 8 or page 9 for you, but that tiny lichen which grows a red hat is in some of the bogs. I don't know, have you met it every heel in the bogs around here? But it's one of the beauties of nature, the lichens. The next one is called A More Cream, and it's a little nature poem as well. It's just simple moment. Wahame rodegen a gapin laroige, bart don cosule triple crive. Darian rudsha as art, ag lúsca sa rí, tíbistig an wala, cangalte rohuv, fuinte lomnocht, eine no wasta, chran hanai, gan dol dírach gudí a bar. Diech me a hui, chompord tolug gorm, yire me stelestran a honig o Susan, vrana me chuachúil, ag mass faid. Bhí sesin húsan sin, beidir gur bise a bhí an. Rubble filte hart ar chran an chrín, bathó go funwer, bhuairicín Dánta. Neamhar dormsa bhí ag fara ag macnamh rudaí a déalaí scrúdú níos céire. Reiche híl me neamhverúnach ní amháinach rua amon síl. And the translation of that on page 11, it was a very simple event, just noticing, thankfully, a red squirrel, not a grey squirrel, a red squirrel, just across from my house. And I thought, lovely. But first of all, I thought it didn't fit in someplace. In the crown of a tree, I spotted an anomaly high in the crest of larch, brown bundle resembling a cluster of branches. It appeared out of place, swaying in the wind just inside the wall, too thickly bound over a bare point. Their ivy wound a narrow stem and greenness, not entirely to the top. I looked north from the comfort of a soft blue couch, focused the celestron that came from Susan and peered one eye, capturing distance. There he was, or perhaps it was a she, tail wrapped around the trunk, feeding busily on small unopened cones, unaware of the watcher pondering possibilities that demanded some closer inspection. What seemed to me an inconsistency was a red squirrel going about its life. And again, biodiversity crops up in the next one. It's called Soldier of the Fields. And it's, I don't know, it's the picture on page 12 or page 13. But anyway, I'll read it. It's a very short poem. Fáiscin sé bromh fér, ribbe den Dugort, agus canan sé port dardan lá teolaí. Cá bhistún nach sí an téisisin a léiríonn nó etlíonn ó sup go sup. Ag éalóhain go tuban, tugan sé na cosa leis. Smólach an tauraí ag crónán sa garaí, colthaí an taidiire mar chosint vital ar a chearúnaí, leagtha go cumasach ar a chéile, scia ag cosint bethe, glas a cuimhnú a héal, an drolín taspaí. By the way, a drolín taspaí is a lovely old Irish name for this insect. And it's called, on page 13, The Soldier of the Field. And if you see there now, you can see, of course, what it is. And the pictures are my own, of course. He clings to a blade of grass, one wisp in a field, and he sings a drumming tune on a warm day. But how do we know that he is not a she, that jumps or flies from thread to thread, suddenly escaping us, absconds? A summer thrush warbling on the edge of fields, dressed in a suit of armour, metal protection on thighs, placed in strategic patterns, a shield guarding life, green on green, sheltering this being, the grasshopper. This one is not a nature poem. It's grád an duine, but it's the love of person, but it's also the love of generations. And this was published in one of the music magazines. It's about my dad looking or transferring his knowledge of music to my daughter. Michal knows my daughter. He met her at the National Biodiversity. Pure accident, but anyway. Ráhara go nóta fada. Ag fara maiad ag múnú a fort ag muín. Ó na mérachas scalpe dá lábhatha snáithe, munglíon fadóg stadach. Bogan a rihim mualaithe, céimena coracha a chuid fáilí, strachan minhuili a chus le cuimhne, ach titin nótaí fada funwara on a hás of chuimhnach. Leanan si a bhéir chéimena tútacha trí wasú gléasacha na gardantaí salí, ag dúnas leta ar a bhólam. Prodan na súla óga trí de chuidse a cheartúháin a bortaracht an chólainn. Muoin stóráilte slán an ish in a níséad stúma, agus coríonn an ceol, caol, clanach, chuig fun réalach ng luan. And on page 15, you'll see a translation. Actually, this is one where the translation does work to an extent. 2 bars of a long note for my dad teaching my daughter his tunes. From the chisel-chipped fingers of his wood-grained hands, a stuttering whistle mumbles. His tempered rhythms soften the erratic beats of neglect. His foot struggles with memory, but long notes of melody tumble from his pleasure. She tracks his fumbling finger steps in grace notes of the Sally Gardens, through a silence intent on knowing. Her eyes recheck through his lilted corrections of the colon, treasures now safely stored in duet. And the music stirs to a reeling cadence of generations. The next piece I'm going to read, I was issued a challenge by a friend of mine from County Longford. He's a Kerryman, and of course Kerrymen are great for issuing challenges. But where I live in Cornamona, there's the Shanwater, a walk that some people know. It was actually written about in the Irish Times. But I was very lucky of a heel to see on that walk a golden eagle. And the peregrine falcon nests still on that mountain, just above that road. And it's lovely to hear, not often see the peregrine, but you'll hear him more often. But a friend of mine issued me a challenge. He's a Kerryman, Eamon, said, write something about the shauk. And the shauk is a lovely word for a hawk. So, but this is what came out. It wasn't about what he wanted, but it came out anyway. An shauk bregach. Crochta chúile ard san úlard, etlíonn sé as cin na dorthaí, sa chiorcail céine a gcónaí, gioblach le guaníir, ó shrang ceangailte, amscaí san éarúr le íomhá daite, bart dianta ag útamáil, scanrúil, caite. Ach cólíonn sé a ghealtanas, fanan an charóg lí amach, ag smedde go bagrach ar charóga lí eile, ag fara díirech sáchfada ó moleach brege. And on page 17 you'll see, by the way, there might be little editing errors on that one, but anyway, does it say on an tall? It should be at all. The imitation hawk. On a tall pole in the orchard, flies above the prized fruit, always in the same circle, ragged from the wind. He flies from a string, awkward in the air, deed being done, frightening, fidgeting, worn. But he fulfills his promise. A grey crow stays away, winks threateningly at other grey crows, watching just far enough away from my imitation hero. Some people know the Shanwater. It's a walk we have near Cornamona, but I've used the walk as a kind of a nature, and yet it's a love of nature and a love of person. Siúl ser agus siúl sír. Siúl mé an Shanwater anocht, le titim gréine, bandarag le mo grim, a wóthar na gapach go dtí an tríú drehead. Ceirivile siúlta le cuinú fánach na nain, Ceirivile smuinmh gach cean futsa. Honnig gealach haar loch, honnig ská gealaí le mo híomh, níor a bháin nach seachmal níor honnig tasa. Bhrenn mé haar gata ard amach ar na hileán, gauna, búia, inis dá wí, crinlán agus ilan an éanar. Cuidas a farc le smut dubh, a cuid air go casta, mé ag maurú ar grúig chatach, daí geal gáirech. Deatach a wad wem mer chliú, tinne an áit éigen a lasar a mo chríiste, hóla mé tardan isce, as ag titim le fána. Sisarnach an tuisce bháin, ag glugarnach as a gléacharm, go gluiseach bertagan fuim na titime. Claphallas na néan ag ciúnú, arú máireach nuair a bheith tú leam me leanán, ní bheith Shanwater adring. Cuníim leam, fúdar fúm a bhaile, I drón bandar ag anis, haar na drehead, nís meile, ag siúl go dtí muignas gan tú. And a translation you'll find on page 19. A walk east and a walk west. I walked the old road tonight, at twilight, pink at my back. From the road of the flowers to the third bridge, 4 miles of walking accompanied by the cry of birds, 4,000 thoughts, everyone about you. The moon came up over the lake. A moon shadow walked at my side, but it was only an illusion. You never came. I looked out over a high gate, out over the islands, Gauna, Booya, Inishdawi, and the island of solitude. Sheep in the field with black faces, horns twisted in a way that left me remembering curly hair, your smiling face. Smoke a long way away on the hill, a fire someplace, an ember in my heart, and then I heard the sound of water, a waterfall. The whispering of white water gurgled and muttered to me that 2 of us might hear the falling sound. A twitter light of birds quietening in the aftermorrow. You will be with me, dearest. There will not be an old road between us. I keep on going in a hurry home towards the last of the pink, over 3 bridges, going slower now, walking through the loneliness without you. And the last piece I'm going to read, tá sé beagán in gáisiúil. In English you might say it's pornographic, but it wasn't written like that. In Irish, it goes, maidin duine. Nocht ag sé, tisa fís na maidina, tíbhlum sa laba, I do hévnas gan curry, ag bahal do onáil go sév. I do bheo go ciúin, drimlum ag colla, de hív yesh go dí ganúsím tú, ganúsím hú le bug chorim a bhéir, gnéis hantach ar de chum agus plusim de wúscailt, farin I buch gwiche. Bug jarán ó de chorp nocht, ag fáiltiú ma hagháil agus tigamid bert an dúiseacht adrin. And I'll finish with the translation of that, even though it's, as I said, schmaltzy and possibly a bit pornographic, but anyway. Our morning, and this is the last piece I'm going to read for you. Our morning. Unclothed at 6, you vision of morning beside me in bed, at rest, without movement, just breathing peacefully. Existing quietly, your back to me as you sleep, on your right-hand side until I awaken you with a longing, a selfish finger stroke on your waist, and I hear you rousing, rain in a puff of wind, a gentle complaint from your naked body, welcoming my touch, and we both understand the wakening between us. Dramatic. Míle buenas. From the first question to the last naughty bit, I hope you enjoyed it anyway. Míle buenas. Thanks, Catherine. Thanks, Catherine.
I hope you enjoyed it.
Piece of crack. Go to Mahogany. Huh? Oh, I don't know who in the audience has
We
grave
are
up the fuck
now nearing the end of our night's proceedings, and just before we conclude, I want to thank Art for the sharing of his superb writings, and I must say there was certainly no meaning lost in translation. I think that we've all been lulled into a meditative state. And it's true what they say, that poetry brings great solace to the listening ear. Before we conclude, I would like to announce that 4 second-year students from Coláiste Pobal are awarded a special prize from the Achill Heinrich Böll Association for their project titled, What Will Life in Achill Look Like for Our Children and Grandchildren? As a group, they considered the 21st century lifestyles of the people of Achill. They identified how cultural practices might be affecting the ecology and sustainability of our island environment. They imagined how Achill life might be for their offspring, and they proposed measures that might maintain our beautiful landscape for future generations. We congratulate the 4 students, Orla Campbell, Orla McNamara, Miles O'Keefe and Sean Gallagher. We thank their teachers, Kevin Egan and Doreen O'Connor, and their prize will be presented at a later date in Colossia Pobalachla. And I think it's safe to say that our future is in safe hands with these students demonstrating such ability and such vision. Well done to them. This brings to an end the formal part of our evening's activities, and our guided walk in the landscape with Micheál O'Brien will focus on climate change, coastal erosion and ACL, and that will commence at the Valley Rovers soccer pitch at the Valley Sandbanks tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. And after hearing Micheál's talk tonight, I'm sure that will be an absolutely excellent guided walk and something for participants to look forward to. Participants are always asked to wear appropriate footwear and clothing and rainwear, because in ACL we can get the 4 seasons in 1 hour, not to mind 1 day. So I'd like you now to invite you now to conclude our evening in Masterson's bar, where we can partake of some light refreshments that Victor and his staff have prepared for us. And thank you for making this evening so memorable and enjoyable. And thank you for being such a wonderful, receptive audience. Thank you. That's me done.